Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe my channel. Daniel's palm hit the polished mahogany table hard enough to rattle the water glasses, and a stack of glossy bank statements skidded toward me under the flat white glare of the fluorescent ceiling panels. The conference room on the 32nd floor smelled like burnt coffee, lemon wood polish, and the cold recycled air that always made Carrington Tower feel more like a museum than a workplace. My brother stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that fit him too tightly through the shoulders. One hand braced against the leather chair beside him, jaw flexing as if fury itself were something he could chew. My husband, David Whitmore, leaned near the wall of smoked glass with his hands in his pockets, silver tie clip catching the light, refusing to meet my eyes. Our mother, Lillian Carrington, sat perfectly upright with both gloved hands folded over her handbag, her diamond ring flashing every time she shifted one finger against the clasp. Martin Keene, our chief financial officer, clicked his pen so fast it sounded like an insect trapped in a window. And next to Daniel, with a legal pad open and a look of professional patience on his face, sat Thomas Bell, the family's outside counsel. Daniel tapped the top page with 2 fingers and smiled at me like he'd already buried me. "No lawyer," he said. "You're finished." No one in the room laughed. That made it worse. Because this wasn't theater. This was an execution, and everyone at that table thought they'd arrived just in time to watch. My name is Elena Carrington. I'm 38. And this is the story of how I let my brother believe he had destroyed me, right up until the moment his own lawyer realized the trap had never been mine. Daniel pulled out the chair across from him with a sharp scrape and pointed at it. "Sit." I stayed standing for a beat longer than he wanted. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him showed a gray Chicago afternoon pressed low over the river, the kind of sky that flattened everything beneath it. Inside the room, the brass trim around the credenza gleamed under the fluorescent light, too bright, too clean, every surface reflecting a version of us that looked colder than we were. I set my bag on the chair at my right, smoothed the sleeve of my navy coat and sat without hurrying. David exhaled through his nose. "Elena," he said, voice carefully measured as if he were already speaking for the record, "before this goes any further, I strongly advise you to cooperate." That hurt in a strangely distant way. Not sharp. Not fresh. More like pressing on a bruise I'd had long enough to memorize. Daniel pushed the first statement closer. $682,000 moved through a shell account under your authority. Vendor reimbursements. Fake consulting retainers. Escrow diversions. He tapped each line as he spoke. You want to explain why your name is attached to all of them. Martin finally stopped clicking his pen and slid a manila folder across the table. "We have the internal transfer logs," he said, not looking at me. "And the authorization sequence." Lillian made a quiet sound in the back of her throat, that old sound she used whenever she wanted to communicate disappointment without having to dirty herself with direct accusation. "Your father built this company from a single hotel," she said. "If you've stolen from this family, Elena, I want you to understand there will be consequences beyond embarrassment." Beyond embarrassment. As if public humiliation in a sealed glass room above the city were only the appetizer. I looked down at the statements. The paper was thick, expensive, heavy stock with that slight sheen people use when they want documents to feel more official than they are. My own name appeared on the authorization header. The transfer dates were there. The vendor line items were there too. Northline Advisory. Cinder Vale Design. Ashcroft Guest Experience. 3 entities that had existed for less than a year and, according to the packet Daniel had theatrically assembled, had apparently drained money from Carrington Hospitality Group's renovation reserves. I flipped one page. Then another. Daniel mistook my silence for fear. He always did that. He thought stillness meant weakness because he had never once in his life been quiet on purpose. "I told you she'd freeze," he said, glancing toward Thomas Bell. "This is what people do when they're caught." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, eyes on the documents. "Elena," he said at last, in that smooth neutral tone attorneys use when they want to sound reasonable while the ground opens beneath you, "if there's an innocent explanation, now would be the time." David stepped away from the glass wall and planted both palms on the back of a chair, leaning in just enough to signal concern without risking solidarity. "Please don't make this uglier than it has to be." I turned and looked at him then. He was wearing the blue tie I bought him in Milan, 2 anniversaries ago. Navy silk, fine diagonal ribbing, hand-rolled edge. I remember because he'd kissed the side of my head in the hotel room mirror while I fixed it against his collar and told me no one ever understood details the way I did. Now that same tie sat perfectly centered against a white shirt I'd had monogrammed for him, and his wedding band flashed once as he adjusted his grip on the chair. He had slept in our guest room the last 3 nights. Not because we'd fought. Because I'd stopped pretending not to know. Daniel saw my gaze and smirked. Still worried about the wrong problem, I see. He circled the table slowly, one hand in his pocket, one hand carrying the packet. His loafers struck the stone floor with metronome precision. Let me make this simple. You resign as Chief Operating Officer effective immediately. You sign over temporary voting control of your shares pending internal review. You give us access to your devices. In exchange, we keep this private. Martin swallowed and added, provided the funds are recoverable. Lillian looked at me with the expression she used at funerals and charity luncheons, the composed face of a woman who preferred tragedy when it arrived in other people's homes. This is the only graceful option left. I leaned back in the chair. The leather was cool through my coat. Somewhere down the hall an elevator chimed. The silence in the room gathered like storm pressure. Then Daniel tossed a second folder in front of me. Inside were printed photographs. A valet envelope from the Blackstone garage. A dinner receipt from Bernardi's on Oak. A still frame from a lobby camera showing me stepping into an elevator. And then very carefully arranged on the next page, images of cash bundles inside a saffron-colored gift bag. Daniel placed both hands on the table and lowered his face to mine. That, he said softly, was almost insulting. Really? Thomas Bell's eyes moved to the photographs. Martin shifted. David straightened, the muscle in his jaw twitching. I let 2 beats pass. Then I looked at Thomas. Did you review the metadata on the photographs before your office printed them? I asked. Or are we doing this the lazy way? For the first time Thomas frowned. Daniel gave a short laugh. There it is. Deflection. No, I said evenly. Sequence. He blinked. I closed the folder, aligned the corners precisely and set it in the center of the table. If you're accusing me of embezzlement, Daniel, you should call the police. Immediately. Martin's head jerked up. David pushed away from the chair. Lillian's fingers tightened on her bag. Daniel smiled again, but it slipped at the edges. You think bluffing helps? I think delay helps guilty people, I said. And I'm getting tired of watching all of you improvise. The silence that followed was absolute. Then I opened my bag, took out my phone, laid its screen down beside the folder and folded my hands. Before anyone else speaks, I said calmly, I have one question. Which one of you decided I'd be easier to frame if my husband helped? No one moved. Not Daniel. Not David. Not even Martin with his nervous pen. Just one tiny reaction from Lillian. Her eyes. Sliding for less than a second toward David. That was all I needed. 3 months earlier, if you had asked me what betrayal looked like, I would have said something dramatic. Lipstick on a collar. A message left open on a phone. Whispered calls behind a closed door. Something simple enough to hate cleanly. I know better now. Real betrayal looks administrative. It looks like invoices arriving 1 minute past midnight from vendors you don't remember approving. It looks like signature requests buried inside budget packets. It looks like your husband casually asking where you keep the backup authentication fob for your home office because he might need to print something while you're in St. Louis for an owners' conference. It looks like your brother suddenly becoming very interested in operational cash flow after spending 15 years treating the company like an inheritance he shouldn't have to learn. It started on a Tuesday in late January, 6 weeks after my father's memorial. Carrington Hospitality Group owned 7 boutique hotels across Chicago, Milwaukee, and Lake Geneva, along with 2 restaurants, an event property in Highland Park, and 1 very expensive half-finished renovation in Fulton Market that had become Daniel's favorite toy. My father, Arthur Carrington, had built the first hotel himself in 1989 after mortgaging everything he had and sleeping in the basement office for 6 months. Daniel inherited his surname. I inherited his appetite for details. For most of our adult lives, that arrangement had kept the company alive. Daniel did brand dinners and investor golf. I handled contracts, staff retention, vendor performance, occupancy forecasting, insurance audits, code compliance, labor disputes, And all the invisible machinery that keeps luxury looking effortless. After our father's stroke, that imbalance became dangerous. During the final year of Dad's illness, I was at the hospital before sunrise and on calls before breakfast. Daniel used that period to drift deeper into numbers he didn't understand and authority he hadn't earned. He started championing consultants, special projects, fast-tracked renovations, strategic partnerships. The kind of phrases men use when they want to sound visionary while someone else cleans up the damage. In January, I noticed 3 consulting invoices tied to the Halcyon House renovation budget. Same format. Same understated gray header. Same elegant little serif font. The problem was the work described in them didn't exist. One invoice referenced guest acoustics flow modeling for a floor plan I personally approved and knew had never changed. Another billed for boutique fragrance deployment analysis, in a property where the scent program had already been negotiated under a flat annual contract. The numbers were large. Not large enough to trigger panic. Just large enough to disappear into an over-budget project and stay there. I called Martin Keene. Martin had worked for us 8 years. He wore expensive socks, never loosened his tie and spoke in careful decimal points. Probably coding overlap, he told me over speakerphone. We've had a lot of late-stage revisions. Send the vendor files. He hesitated. Barely. A whisper of a pause. Of course. The files arrived 20 minutes later. Northline Advisory LLC had been incorporated 11 months earlier. Its address was a mail-receiving suite in Naperville. Its engagement letter was signed by Daniel. Its first retainer had been approved 3 days after Dad lost the ability to speak. I remember staring at that date for a long time while the winter light from my office window spread dull and silver across the carpet. Then I opened the document properties. Created on a laptop registered to David Whitmore Legal Consulting. My husband wasn't company counsel. He'd done occasional outside review work for us over the years through his firm Whitmore and Lang, but he never touched operations unless I asked. And I hadn't asked. That was the moment something inside me became very still. Not broken. Not shocked. So, please subscribe my channel. The next few days I changed nothing on the surface. I went to meetings. I answered emails. I had dinner with my mother at the Drake and listened to her talk about Memorial Foundation planning while her teaspoon clicked against porcelain. I sat across from Daniel in an executive session and watched him pretend to understand debt service ratios. I lay beside David in our bedroom while he scrolled through his phone with the brightness turned almost all the way down and said he was just under pressure at work. Then I started building a duplicate trail. People imagine preparation as some glamorous montage of secret meetings and dramatic revelations. In reality, it's mostly patience, screenshots, backups, quiet phone calls taken in stairwells, naming files clearly, not reacting when you want to, letting people think their carelessness is still invisible. I began with access logs. Every financial authorization above $50,000 at Carrington required a rotating token and device pairing. The person approving could be remote, but the token left a timestamped signature. Martin assumed I rarely checked those logs because I trusted our system. He was right. Until I didn't. By the end of that first week I had a pattern. Multiple approvals tied to my credentials were originating from either Daniel's executive floor or David's firm. Never both on the same day. Never while I was physically present in either location. Always on days when my calendar had me elsewhere and my phone location could verify it. I called internal security and requested a software audit under the pretense of a cyber insurance review. Then I called a forensic accountant I trusted, Leonard Cho, whom I'd met during a wage classification dispute 4 years earlier when he dismantled an opposing expert so politely the man thanked him afterward. Leonard met me at a quiet bar in River North with walnut panels, dim amber lighting, and booths so deep they felt like confessions. He wore the same rectangular glasses I remembered and ordered hot tea instead of alcohol. I handed him 3 folders and said, "If I'm wrong, I need to know fast. If I'm right, I need to know quietly." He read for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he took off his glasses and set them on the table. "You're not wrong," he said. "You're early." There's a kind of relief that feels nothing like comfort. Hearing that I wasn't imagining it didn't make me feel safer. It just made the horizon visible. "Can you prove where it leads?" "Yes," he said. "If they keep moving." I let out a breath. "They will." He studied my face for a second. How bad do you think it is? I thought about the vendor files. The false approvals. The way David had started taking calls on the balcony even in January cold. The way Daniel's confidence had swelled without any business reason to explain it. Bad enough, I said, that they think they've already won. He nodded slowly. Then don't interrupt them. That became the strategy. I opened a monitored internal holding account under a Treasury review protocol that allowed us to isolate suspect transfers without immediately freezing them. The account was dry, lawful, fully documented, and designed for exactly this kind of problem. But I titled it in a way only someone browsing superficially would misread. If you were stealing casually, it looked like a soft target. If you knew what you were doing, it looked like a trap. Daniel and Martin found it within 10 days. The first transfer was $84,000. The second was $122,000. The third came through on a Saturday morning while I was in Aspen speaking on a hotel operations panel, which was useful because the conference photographs, airline records, and keynote footage established exactly where I was when I, supposedly, approved it. I watched the account activity from a hotel balcony with snow on the rails and thin mountain sunlight spilling over white rooftops like ground glass. I felt strangely calm. Like I was standing outside my own life, observing a machine finally reveal its design. That same weekend I got confirmation of something uglier. David forgot to log out of his cloud drive. He'd been careless before, but betrayal makes people greedy and greed makes them sloppy. There, inside a shared folder labeled Q2 Exposure, were draft talking points, legal review notes, and a folder named Contingency. I opened it. Inside were memos about succession control if I were removed from executive duties for cause. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, still wearing my conference blazer, and read every file. Daniel wanted voting control of my shares, temporarily, which under our bylaws could have been stretched for months if framed as reputational risk. Lillian wanted the scandal contained before spring gala season and before the Arthur Carrington Memorial Fund launched publicly. Martin wanted indemnity. And David, my husband, the man who once cried in our kitchen because he said no one had ever made him feel safe the way I did, had drafted a recommendation that my device access be seized before I had an opportunity to alter records. There was one more document. A purchase proposal for my equity. Distress valuation. 42% below fair range. Prepared by Thomas Bell's office. Not criminal. Not yet. But predatory enough to show intent. That was when I knew the room on the 32nd floor wasn't a reaction. It was choreography. And somewhere inside all of that, another truth had been waiting, patient and ugly. Sienna Brooks, that if you had glanced at us in a hallway, you would have thought she and I belonged to different stories. She was our director of brand partnerships, 12 years younger than me, all luminous skin and immaculate tailoring, with a soft Tennessee voice that made even blunt statements sound gracious. She understood visual language, customer psychology, event optics. She could make an opening dinner feel like a film premiere. My mother adored her because she moved through expensive rooms as if she'd been born to polished marble and champagne flutes. I liked her because she worked hard and didn't waste words. The first thing that made me suspicious wasn't perfume or lipstick or some cliché from a second-rate drama. It was reimbursement timing. David had submitted dinner receipts from places he claimed were client meetings on nights. Sienna's expense reports showed matching restaurants, matching neighborhoods, matching car service windows. Then there was a boutique hotel in New York during a brand summit. I was unable to attend because my father had developed pneumonia. David sent me a photo of his room service breakfast. Sienna posted a shot of sunrise from a different angle but the same balcony rail. I didn't confront either of them. Not then. I'm not saying that to sound noble. I'm saying it because by that point I already knew I was standing inside a broader theft, and emotional spectacle would only warn them to hide better. So I did what I kept doing. I watched. In March, Sienna asked to see me privately. Not in my office. Not at the company. At a coffee shop in Old Town with weathered oak tables and a brass espresso machine that hissed between customers. Rain striped the front windows. She arrived without makeup for the first time I'd ever seen, hair pulled back, fingers wrapped so tightly around a paper cup the lid bowed inward. I know you know, she said. There are moments when the body reacts before thought catches up. My pulse stayed steady, but I felt my shoulders settle, as if some invisible weight had finally chosen a direction. About which part? I asked. Her eyes filled and then cleared again. He was trying very hard not to cry. David, she said. And Daniel. And the invoices. That was when I really looked at her. The tremor in her thumb. The lack of jewelry. The faint purple under her eyes. She looked less like a mistress caught in a scandal than like someone who had realized the building she trusted was on fire from the inside. He told me you'd never find out, she said. Then 2 weeks ago I heard Daniel on speaker saying if this blows up they can let Brand take the fall. He said I'm replaceable. I stirred my coffee once. Fully. And now. He swallowed. Now I have copies. That was the beginning of our alliance. Not friendship. Not forgiveness. Just clarity. Over the next month, Sienna sent me what she could without tripping alarms. Drafts of campaign invoices altered after approval, text threads between Daniel and Martin, a voice memo she'd made by accident, or maybe on purpose, while waiting outside Daniel's office. In that recording, Daniel said with terrible casualness, "If Elena gets difficult, David handles her. If accounting gets noisy, Martin pins the overages on operations." I listened to it in my parked car outside our house at 11:14 p.m. while the porch light reflected on the windshield in pale gold bars. Then I went inside, kissed my husband on the cheek and asked if he wanted tea. That is the part people romanticize later. They call it strength. Didn't feel like strength. Felt like control. And control was colder. So when Daniel stood over me in the 32nd floor conference room and said, "No lawyer? You're finished," what he didn't understand was that I had already spent 93 days making sure every lie he planned to tell would arrive gift-wrapped and traceable. I reached for my phone, turned it over and unlocked it. Daniel straightened. "What are you doing?" "I'm deciding," I said, "how much dignity I want to leave you with." Thomas Bell's pen stopped moving. I connected my phone to the screen at the end of the room. The monitor flickered once, then filled with a clean white file index. Rows of dates. Folders. Video icons. PDFs. Martin's face changed first. Some people lose color all at once. He seemed to lose it in layers. Daniel scoffed. "A slideshow. Great." "No," I said. "A timeline." I tapped the first folder. On the screen appeared a travel itinerary, time-stamped keynote footage, and conference registration documents from Aspen. My own face on stage beneath event lighting, speaking to a room of hotel owners while a timestamp glowed in the lower corner. "The transfer on March 9th, I said, "was authorized under my credentials at 10:42 a.m. Central. At 10:42 a.m. Central, I was speaking live in Colorado in front of 214 attendees, one event photographer, and a streamed recording archive that's already been preserved." I moved to the next item. An access report. Device pairing history. Geographic login data. The authorization token used for that transfer paired from David's office network. David's mouth opened. Closed. Daniel barked a laugh. "Too fast. You're married." He had access. "So what?" "So that means my credentials were cloned," I said calmly. "Which is felony conduct, Daniel, not an inconvenience." Thomas Bell turned to David. "Is that true?" David's voice came out thin. "I don't know what this is." I tapped again. A second screen. Incorporation records for Northline Advisory LLC, Cinder Vale Design, and Ashcroft Guest Experience. Registered agents. Mailbox leases. Tax IDs. Cross-referenced addresses. 91% of the funds you say I diverted went to 3 vendors created after my father lost speech capacity. All 3 share formation infrastructure with a business services firm whose invoice history intersects with Whitmore and Lang. Thomas's head snapped back toward the screen. I zoomed in on the document properties. Created by Whitmore. Edited by McKean. Reviewed by Bell_Associate 3. Thomas Bell went still. Not confused. So, like a man hearing a floorboard crack beneath a rug and realizing the room isn't built the way he was told. Daniel pointed at the screen. "That proves nothing." "Of course it does," I said. "It proves your evidence packet and your shell vendors came from overlapping document chains." Martin tried to speak, failed, cleared his throat and tried again. "File metadata can be altered." "Yes," I said. "But server archives are harder to negotiate with." I pulled up the next file. It was a PDF of the accusation packet Thomas's office had sent my assistant that morning. On screen it looked ordinary. Then I toggled the layer history. Comment boxes bloomed open in the margin like bruises surfacing under skin. One read, use photo set 3. Cache looks better. Another, move before Q2 review. And one from a user registered to David's cloud account, said, if Elena won't sign, proceed with cause and force share hold. Thomas Bell sat back in his chair as if the leather had suddenly become unstable beneath him. Daniel looked at David. What the hell is that? David's ears had gone red. Draft language. It doesn't mean. It means, I said quietly, that the package you used to accuse me still contains your planning notes. The silence hit the room like wet concrete. Lillian rose halfway out of her chair. David. He turned toward her. I didn't know those comments were still embedded. That, more than anything, was what made me almost laugh. Not because it was funny. Because even then, even with the structure collapsing around him, his first instinct was still technical. Not denial. Not apology. Just poor execution. I tapped the screen again. This time the image was grainy security footage from a service corridor at our Fulton Market renovation site. Date stamp in the corner. Industrial lighting. Concrete floor. Martin Keene stepping into frame carrying a saffron gift bag. He paused by a storage cage, looked over each shoulder, then placed the bag on a folding table. 30 seconds later, Daniel entered, took photographs with his phone, rearranged the bills and photographed them again. Martin made a sound I can only describe as collapse. Daniel slammed both hands onto the table. Where did you get that? From company cameras, I said. You should really stop assuming operations belongs to you just because you sit in a bigger office. Lillian sank back into her chair. Her lipstick, always immaculate, looked suddenly too bright against her face. David took a step toward me. Elena, listen. No, I said, finally looking at him. You listen. I let the next file load slowly on purpose. A voice memo. The room filled with static, then Daniel's voice, unmistakable, irritated and lazy at once. If Elena gets difficult, David handles her. If accounting gets noisy, Martin pins the overages on operations. We do this before the springboard review or Mother loses her nerve. By the time the recording ended, Daniel looked like someone had reached inside his chest and turned the temperature down. Thomas Bell closed his legal pad. Daniel, he said, each syllable precise, did you provide my office with materials you knew had been manipulated? No, Daniel snapped. This is her spinning. Thomas stood. That was the moment the title of the story happened. Not when Daniel mocked me. Not when David betrayed me. Not even when the first false invoice landed. It happened when Thomas Bell looked from the screen to the packet in front of him and all the practiced neutrality drained out of his face. He went pale. Truly pale. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. The way people do when a professional risk becomes personal and immediate. Because he understood before anyone else in that room what the documents meant. He understood exposure. Fraud. Spoliation. Conspiracy. He understood that if he said the wrong thing next, he'd move from witness to participant. He gathered his papers with careful fingers. I'm going to advise, he said slowly, that this meeting end now. Daniel stared at him. Are you serious? Yes, Thomas said. And I advise everyone here to stop speaking. I took a sip of water. Fully. Deliberately. The glass was cool, condensation slick against my fingertips. Across from me, Daniel's breathing had gone shallow. Martin was wiping one palm against his trouser leg. David looked like he wanted to speak and run at the same time. Lillian kept her back straight because posture was the last weapon she still trusted. Actually, I said, setting the glass down, the only thing finished here is the story you planned to tell about me. Daniel jabbed a finger in my direction. You think this changes anything? You came in alone. I came in prepared. He laughed once, but it broke in the middle. Prepared for what? For you, I said. I disconnected my phone, slid it into my bag and stood. Then I placed one business card in front of Thomas Bell. Naomi Pierce. Pierce Wexler LLP. Thomas read the name and looked up sharply. I haven't retained her yet, I said. I wanted to see whether you'd all do this in person first. David's eyes narrowed. Yet. I adjusted my cuff. You mistook the absence of a lawyer for the absence of a case. Daniel moved toward me. You can't walk out and pretend this goes away. I met his gaze. No, I said quietly. I'm walking out because the next conversation will be on paper. Then I looked at David. You should pack a bag before the locks change. The next few days moved with the strange, airless clarity that follows impact. Everyone in our orbit knew something had happened by noon. By 3 there were rumors. By evening, Daniel had cancelled 2 investor dinners, Martin had called in sick, and Whitmore and Lang had quietly removed David from a hospitality panel scheduled for the following week. I spent that first night alone in the house. Not because I was shattered. Because I was busy. I sat at the kitchen island under pendant lights that cast warm circles on the marble and forwarded archived files to Naomi Pierce. Outside, the last of the March rain shone dark on the street. Inside, everything felt almost offensively normal. The copper fruit bowl. The cashmere throw over the den sofa. David's spare reading glasses beside the guest room sink where he'd left them 3 days earlier, probably assuming he'd be back in the master bedroom once the board did its work. At 9:17 p.m. Naomi called. She didn't waste time with reassurance. That was one of the reasons I chose her. I've reviewed enough to tell you this is no longer a family dispute, she said. Her voice was low, clipped, East Coast precise. This is coordinated financial misconduct with attempted coercive transfer of equity. I leaned against the counter. Can you prove it? Yes, she said. Can you tolerate what proving it will require? I looked through the black window over the sink and saw my own reflection, phone against my ear, face composed in a room that still contained the shape of my marriage. Yes. Good, she said. Because we're not going to react. We're going to sequence. There's a particular peace in hearing a dangerous person speak your language. Over the next 10 days, Naomi built the formal confrontation Daniel never saw coming. Her office occupied the 21st floor of a limestone building on LaSalle with brass elevator grills, dark walnut paneling, and reception chairs upholstered in green leather so supple they looked expensive enough to discourage lying. When I first arrived there, carrying 3 banker's boxes and a hard drive, the morning sun was striking the lobby stone in long gold bars. By then I had slept maybe 9 hours total over 3 nights, but exhaustion had burned down into something sharper. Naomi's team moved like clockwork. No dramatic exclamations. No false comfort. Just method. Leonard Cho mapped the money. A digital forensics consultant traced device usage. A former federal investigator named Carla Ruiz reconstructed the timeline around my father's incapacity and the creation of the shell vendors. Sienna met with Naomi under a confidentiality agreement and delivered the rest. That was when I learned the full shape of it. Daniel had started siphoning renovation overages nearly a year earlier. Initially in small amounts routed through fabricated consulting and design review costs. Martin Keene structured them so they blended into budget inflation. David helped draft the paper trail and advised on privilege strategy if questions arose. After my father's stroke, when executive oversight weakened and my attention split between hospital nights and company operations, Daniel accelerated. He intended to consolidate control before the board noticed how much cash had disappeared. But theft wasn't the end game. Control was. Daniel believed the company should have been his by right, because he was the eldest and because rooms listened when he spoke loudly enough. I was useful to him as long as I remained the adult in the room with no appetite for spectacle. Once my father died and my voting block became inconvenient, the plan shifted. Dirty my name. Spend me. Freeze my access. Force a discount sale under reputational pressure. Fold my equity back into family control. Keep the scandal private. David's role in it was almost worse than Daniel's because it required intimacy to function. He knew where I worked, how I filed things, what I ignored when I was tired, how late I stayed at the office on Tuesdays, which security protocols I considered sufficient. He knew how to mimic my habits because he'd lived inside them. When Naomi said that out loud, I sat very still in the leather chair across from her desk. The betrayal vector here is marital access, she said. Such a clean phrase for something so ugly. I looked at the skyline beyond her window. And Sienna. Naomi's expression didn't change. He was involved with her, yes. There was. Little. Flat. Put on the table like an evidence item. I surprised myself by not asking how long it had been going on. That question belonged to a different woman. A woman who still thought chronology could alter pain. What did she say? That he promised he'd leave you after the spring gala. That Daniel promised her an executive promotion. That once she heard them discussing scapegoating, she started preserving records. I nodded once. Naomi watched me. Do you need a moment? No, I said. I need the rest. So she gave me the rest. David had not only drafted internal exposure memos and helped structure false evidence. He had also used privilege language to shield some of Daniel's communications and attempted to build a plausible narrative around my supposed financial instability by collecting selective examples of aggressive cost control and reframing them as erratic behavior. In plain English, my husband had been preparing to help my brother tell the world I was unstable enough to steal and unstable enough to believe I hadn't. That night I went home, opened David's closet and packed every suit, every shirt, every pair of shoes, every leather weekender and every monogrammed cufflink into garment bags and boxes. The housekeeper had already changed the linens in the guest room, which somehow felt more intimate than anything else. I placed the boxes in the mudroom beneath the frosted glass pendant light and sent David one message. Your things will be released through counsel. He replied in under a minute. Elena, please don't do this. Daniel panicked. I can explain. Then another. I never meant for it to go this far. Then another. Talk to me. I archived all three without answering. There is a special kind of power in not responding to a man who has built his confidence on access. 4 days later, Naomi's office sent formal notices. Preservation demands. Litigation hold language. Notice of potential claims including fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy, attempted coercion, device compromise, spoliation exposure and marital misuse of confidential access. Simultaneously, she requested an emergency special board session and invited separate counsel for all participants. That invitation fractured the alliance exactly the way she predicted. Thomas Bell withdrew within hours. Martin retained his own attorney by morning. Lillian called me 6 times in one day and left 3 voicemails that moved in elegant sequence from indignation to injury to maternal nostalgia. Elena, this is becoming ugly. Elena, families handle these matters privately. Elena, call me. You know your father would never have wanted lawyers involved. The irony of that last message almost deserved applause. Because my father, for all his flaws, had taught me one lesson Daniel never absorbed. When people insist something stay private, it is usually because privacy is the only shield they have left. The formal confrontation took place 11 days after the ambush, in a corner conference room at Pierce Wexler overlooking the river. The room was designed to intimidate without seeming to try. Gleaming walnut table. Soft leather chairs. Art so expensive it looked accidental. Water carafes on silver trays. The air carried that faint scent of paper, coffee and polished wood that clings to high-stakes firms. Mid-morning sun filtered through sheer shades and turned the brass hardware along the credenza into narrow lines of fire. I arrived first with Naomi and Leonard. I wore a cream silk blouse, charcoal suit, low black heels, and the Cartier watch my father gave me when I closed our first union negotiation alone at 29. Not armor. Just memory. Naomi arranged binders by seat with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. Leonard checked the screen. Carla Ruiz stood near the sideboard with a tablet in hand, expression unreadable. On the wall monitor behind us waited a title slide containing one phrase only. Carrington Hospitality Group. Coordinated Diversion and Coercive Equity Scheme. Naomi noticed me reading it. Too much, she asked. No, I said. Just enough. They arrived in stages. Martin first, carrying a briefcase with both hands, shoulders rounded, tie slightly crooked. Then Lillian with her attorney, Patricia Sloan, in dove gray wool and pearls so deliberate they almost read as parody. Daniel came next with a litigation partner from a downtown firm I recognized by reputation, though not by face. He looked thinner. Angrier too, but anger no longer fit him the way it had in the boardroom. It sat on him now like borrowed clothing. David came last. He had shaved. He always shaved carefully before difficult conversations, as if clean lines could produce moral clarity. The navy tie was gone. Today he wore plain charcoal, no tie clip, no wedding ring. He did not look at me when he sat down. That was the first power shift. In the ambush room, they had arranged themselves around me like hunters around open ground. Here they took seats as instructed, each near their own counsel, separated by folders, rules and recorded chronology. Their bodies had changed. Daniel's knee bounced once beneath the table. Martin touched his collar twice in under a minute. Lillian placed her handbag in her lap like a shield. David kept his hands flat on the table, fingertips spread as if trying to prove to himself they were steady. Naomi opened the meeting. "Thank you all for attending," she said. "This session concerns evidence of misappropriation, fabricated vendor activity, unauthorized credential use, attempted reputational coercion, and an equity transfer strategy targeted at my client, Elena Carrington." Daniel leaned back with theatrical boredom. "We dispute that framing." Naomi didn't look at him. "You'll have an opportunity to do more than that if you reject what's in front of you." She nodded to Leonard. The screen changed. A timeline appeared, clean and devastating. March 14th. Arthur Carrington suffers major stroke, speech capacity impaired. March 17th. Northline Advisory LC formed. March 20th. First consulting retainer approved by Daniel Carrington. April 2nd. Credential pairing anomaly tied to Elena Carrington authorization profile. April 9th. Draft succession control memo created by David Whitmore. May 11th. Renovation overage routed through Cinder Vale design. June 2nd. Home office access event during Elena's absence. July 18th. Internal packet discussing cause removal and share hold. August 4th. Cache staging photographs created at Fulton site. August 9th. Ambush packet assembled with embedded comments. August 12th. Emergency board confrontation. Leonard spoke in a voice so even it made every date feel heavier. "We traced 3 shell vendors, 6 fraudulent line items for compromised authorization events, and a pattern of pre-planned narrative construction designed to attribute discovered losses to Ms. Carrington before Q2 review." He moved one point at a time. Bank routing overlaps. Device ID correlations. Mailbox registrations. Anomalous approval windows. The sort of methodical sequence that leaves no room for indignation because indignation requires ambiguity, and ambiguity had been stripped from the room piece by piece. Daniel interrupted twice. "This is circumstantial. That's not criminal." Naomi let him talk just long enough to sound impatient, then said, "You should conserve your energy. We haven't reached the voice files yet." He fell silent. That was the second power shift. Carla Ruiz took over the next segment and walked the room through premeditation. Not suspicion. Not inference. Premeditation. She laid out the progression from financial diversion to governance strategy, showing how the money trail and the attempted equity seizure advanced together. The documents went up on the screen one after another. Draft operating narratives. Internal notes. The discount purchase proposal. The suggestion that my devices be seized for preservation. The plan to exploit reputational risk clauses in our bylaws. Lillian's attorney spoke first. "Mrs. Carrington was not involved in any operational billing." "No," Carla said. "She was involved in endorsing a contingent control response once losses surfaced." The next document appeared. An email from Lillian to Daniel and David, sent at 1:14 a.m., reading, "If she has embarrassed this family, I will not allow sentiment to interfere." Lillian's shoulders stiffened. "That is being taken out of context." Naomi finally looked at her. "Then by all means provide the context in discovery." The silence that followed hummed in the vents. "Please subscribe my channel." Then came the unexpected ally. Naomi touched the remote once and a new heading appeared. Witness cooperation. Sienna Brooks. David closed his eyes. Daniel's whole body turned toward him. "What?" Naomi continued as if no one had spoken. "Ms. Brooks has provided corroborating documents, contemporaneous communications, altered billing drafts and audio evidence. She is prepared to testify regarding discussions involving falsified campaign allocations, misuse of brand budgets, and plans to assign liability to both Ms. Carrington and Ms. Brooks if internal review intensified." Daniel stared at David with naked disbelief. "You told me she was handled." David's mouth tightened. "I thought she was." Naomi raised one eyebrow. "That was your first mistake. I spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Sienna didn't switch sides because of me," I said. "She switched because both of you assumed loyalty could be rented indefinitely." Daniel looked at me. "You expect me to believe she just came to you?" "No," I said. I expect you to understand that disposable people eventually notice the pattern. That was when the fractures became visible. Martin turned toward Daniel. You said the brand allocations were clean. Daniel snapped. Because David said they were. David shot back. Because Martin structured them. Lillian hissed. Stop speaking over counsel. Patricia Sloane placed a hand on Lillian's sleeve. Daniel's attorney leaned in, whispering urgently. Martin's lawyer opened his briefcase with shaking fingers. The room began to split along the lines Naomi had predicted. Not family, not alliance, just individual survival. I watched it happen with a kind of distant calm. Not joy. Not exactly. More like the satisfaction of seeing a hidden structure finally exposed to daylight. Naomi let the crossfire burn for 10 seconds, then said, if we are done reenacting the collapse, we can proceed to options. Everyone stopped. She slid a packet forward. Our client is prepared to pursue civil claims immediately and make criminal referrals where appropriate. However, she is offering a narrow path to structured resolution. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. How generous. Naomi ignored him. Option 1, she said, we file this week. We seek injunctive relief, emergency governance intervention, forensic expansion, turnover of devices, clawback, reputational damages, and referral packages to state and federal authorities. Option 2, you cooperate now. Full resignations where appropriate. Share restoration. Restitution. Sworn admissions. Independent monitor. Immediate separation of involved parties from Carrington operations. Confidentiality only to the extent legally permissible. Daniel's attorney spoke carefully. And if my client refuses? Naomi smiled without warmth. Then your client can explain the phrase force share hold to a judge. David finally looked at me. Not through me. At me. Elena, he said, and I had to give him credit for this at least. He kept his voice almost steady. Whatever happened between us, you know Daniel was the one driving this. I turned my head slightly. Sunlight had shifted across the table and was catching the water carafe in broken bands of white. David's reflection wavered in the glass. That's not a defense, I said. His throat moved. I was trying to contain him. No, I replied evenly. You were trying to survive him. Daniel slammed the table. You sanctimonious coward. David half rose. Don't. Sit down, his attorney snapped. Martin muttered. This is unbelievable. Lillian looked at Daniel as if seeing him clearly for the first time and resenting the inconvenience of it. You told me this was precautionary. Daniel laughed once, harsh and stunned. And you wanted it. Not like this. I almost spoke then, almost said that there is no like this, when the foundation itself is rotten, only better lighting and more expensive paper. But Naomi got there first. Mrs. Carrington, she said, there was never going to be a refined version of fraud. The next hour was technical and brutal. Terms, carve-outs, governance language, tolling agreements, device turnover, independent audit appointment, interim CEO replacement, settlement architecture. The signing wasn't immediate, but capitulation began there in visible increments. Martin agreed first. He would cooperate in exchange for a narrowed civil posture and a formal acknowledgement of separate counsel. He looked like a man climbing into a lifeboat while pretending it was a professional preference. Lillian followed after Patricia Sloane spent 12 straight minutes whispering in her ear while Lillian stared at the table and touched the edge of her ring with her thumb. She would relinquish interim trust influence and support an emergency board reconstitution. Daniel held out longest because surrender requires self-knowledge and Daniel had always outsourced his. He kept trying to perform indignation, but every document pulled him back into fact. The audio, the comments, the timeline, the shell vendors, the discount equity proposal, the staging photographs. At one point he turned to me and said with a kind of desperate contempt, "You planned this." I met his gaze. "I planned for you," I said. He shook his head. "You left that account there for us." "Yes." His attorney looked sharply at him. I folded my hands. "I made sure you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find." That line landed the way I knew it would. Because all at once, Daniel understood the size of the insult. Not that I had defended myself. That I had accounted for him. Measured his greed accurately enough to lead it. He sat back hard in his chair. Then I added, "Next time, Make sure they're not working for both sides. I didn't look at David when I said it. I looked at Daniel. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw David flinch anyway. By late afternoon, the outlines were fixed. Daniel would resign from all executive roles pending a formal board vote, surrender certain voting rights, and submit to forensic review of personal and business accounts tied to the vendor network. Martin would provide full cooperation and a sworn chronology. Lillian would support an emergency governance correction and cease interference in operations. David would withdraw from every matter touching Carrington, provide device access relevant to the scheme, and accept that our divorce would now proceed under conditions far less flattering than he had imagined. There was one final sticking point. Daniel wanted language preserving his reputation. Naomi almost laughed. Then I surprised everyone, including myself, by speaking first. Keep the dignity clause, I said. Naomi glanced at me. Daniel looked wary. Why? I stood. The leather chair whispered softly against the floor. Outside, afternoon had deepened into that smoky blue hour before evening, when the river darkens and office windows begin reflecting each other back. The room smelled faintly of coffee gone cold. I gathered my copy of the agreement and slid a pen toward Daniel. Because reputation is what people say before the documents arrive, I said quietly. Sign. He stared at me for a long time. Then he signed. Martin signed after him. Lillian after Martin. David last. He held the pen the way men do when they know they are crossing a line they spent months pretending not to see. His signature looked smaller than usual. When it was done, Naomi collected the pages and rose to shake hands with counsel. I didn't. Daniel stood as I turned to leave. This isn't over, he said. I paused with my hand on the polished brass door handle. Then I looked back at him, at the man who had spent his whole life believing volume was the same thing as authority, and I gave him the only thing that still felt worth saying. You're right, I said. It's just no longer yours. 6 months later, I woke to sunlight across pale oak floors and the sound of my espresso machine warming in a kitchen that belonged only to me. My apartment sits on the north side of the river in a renovated brick building with black steel windows, limestone counters, and a narrow balcony full of herbs I keep forgetting I'm capable of growing. In the mornings, light comes through the glass in long soft bands and turns everything honey-colored for about 20 minutes. That has become my favorite part of the day. Not because it's dramatic. Because it isn't. Stability, I learned, is quiet. I stood barefoot on the warm wood floor in a gray cashmere robe, poured coffee into a white ceramic mug and carried it to the balcony. September air moved cool against my skin. Below me, the city was already awake. Buses sighing at the curb, a cyclist weaving through traffic, sunlight glazing the river in broken gold. For the first time in a very long time, no one could use my competence against me. The company survived. Not elegantly. Not painlessly. But it survived. The board, once forced to confront actual documents instead of Daniel's charisma, acted with astonishing speed. Interim leadership changed. Independent review expanded. Old pet projects vanished under scrutiny. Contracts were renegotiated. 2 properties were stabilized. One vanity renovation Daniel had championed with the feverish certainty of a man decorating his own myth got paused indefinitely after auditors discovered half the projected return had been invented in a pitch deck. I stepped into the role of Chief Executive Officer 3 months after the settlement. That sentence still sounds strange sometimes. Not because I doubted I could do it. Because I had spent so many years making sure everything worked that I hadn't noticed how often I was leaving my own name off the credit line. Karmic justice in real life rarely arrives as lightning. It arrives as paperwork, consequences, and rooms that stop opening when you walk toward them. Daniel lost everything he thought made him untouchable first. He resigned for personal reasons, which fooled no one with an email account. Then came the follow-on findings. Unauthorized vendor relationships, concealed transfers, personal use of company-funded renovations, false expense representations. The private clubs that used to seat him immediately now returned his calls through assistants. Investors who once tolerated his swagger because the company still produced results suddenly discovered they preferred distance. He sold the Fulton Market condo at a loss 3 months after the story began circulating in board circles. I heard he tried to reposition himself as a consultant to family businesses in transition. The irony was so sharp I let myself enjoy it for a full 2 seconds before moving on. Lillian's consequence was more social than legal, which suited her because society had always been the arena she valued most. When the Memorial Foundation quietly postponed its launch and several host committees stopped inviting her to chair events, she discovered too late that status depends on consensus more than money. The women who once air-kissed her under crystal chandeliers began speaking to her with careful politeness, the kind reserved for people whose names have acquired footnotes. No one exiled her. That would have given her drama. They simply made space around her. For a woman like my mother, isolation in a crowded room is its own sentence. David's fall was slower and in some ways, more satisfying because it attacked the precise vanity he prized most, professional elegance. He was never disbarred. People love clean endings. Life prefers textured ones. What happened instead was worse for a man like him. Whitmore and Lang asked him to take an extended leave. Clients moved quietly elsewhere. Invitations thinned. A conference chair he'd pursued for years went to another partner. By the time our divorce finalized, he was consulting independently from a furnished office 2 floors above a med spa in River North, telling people he'd chosen a more flexible lifestyle. His LinkedIn posts became almost aggressively thoughtful. That told me everything. And yes, Sienna left him. Not for me. Not because of me. Because once the shine came off both Daniel and David, what remained was exactly what it had always been. 2 men who treated admiration like a utility. Martin took the earliest deal and therefore kept the most salvageable future. He cooperated fully, returned what he could, and disappeared into a quieter accounting role at a logistics company in Indiana, which somehow feels cosmically correct. Sometimes karma doesn't destroy a person. Sometimes it relocates them to a life proportionate to their courage. As for the rest of the enablers, they each received their own smaller reckonings. One board member who had signed whatever Daniel placed in front of him without reading now lectures very publicly about governance reform, which I suppose is one way to turn humiliation into branding. A facilities director who helped stage access logs was let go after the independent monitor found inconsistencies in archived entries. One of Daniel's favorite investor friends stopped taking his calls altogether after realizing he had nearly been dragged into the deal flow around the shell vendors. Every one of them learned the same lesson at a different price point. Proximity to arrogance does not exempt you from fallout. The messages kept coming for months. First angry, then strategic, then sentimental. Daniel texted 2 days after the settlement. "You've made your point." I archived it. A week later. "This is still family." 3 weeks after that at 1:02 a.m. "If Dad could see what you've done, he'd be sick." Lillian preferred voicemail. Her voice always arrived smooth as silk and twice as binding. "Elena, whatever has happened, a mother should not need to schedule time through counsel to speak with her daughter." "Elena, Thanksgiving will be difficult enough." "Elena, the family is not the same." David oscillated between legal practicality and nostalgia, which was almost embarrassing to watch. "I'm not contesting the apartment artwork. Keep it. I found the receipt for your grandmother's bracelet if you still want it. I miss who we were before all this." That one I read twice, not because I believed it but because I wanted to examine the shape of the lie. Before all this. As if all this were weather. As if betrayal had blown in from somewhere external and not been drafted by his own hand. Archived that too. There is freedom in becoming inaccessible to people who once treated your attention like a permanent resource. The new venture came almost by accident. After the settlement, 3 women in hospitality leadership, 2 I knew personally, 1 by referral, asked whether I could review internal irregularities at their companies informally. Then another founder called about an operations conflict wrapped in financial fog. Then a restaurant group asked whether I would advise on executive controls during expansion. Naomi told me to stop giving that work away for free. So I started Carrington Advisory, a governance and operational risk firm for founder-led hospitality brands and family-owned businesses navigating succession, fraud exposure, and internal control breakdown. Sounds technical because it is. But underneath the structure, the work is simple. I help people see what others are trying to hide. I help companies distinguish incompetence from design. I help women in executive roles document things before documentation becomes survival. Apparently I'm very good at it. There's a line between being broken by an ordeal and being educated by it. I built the firm on that line. And I was not alone. Naomi remained what she became during that summer. Not exactly a friend at first, but an ally forged under pressure into something warmer. Leonard still sends me elegantly smug audit jokes no one else enjoys. Carla Ruiz, who once interrogated a man into confessing through nothing but silence and a legal pad, now occasionally meets me for tacos and talks about motorcycles. And then there was Sienna. If you told me during the first weeks that the woman my husband was sleeping with would someday be one of the people I trusted to tell me the truth, I would have looked at you like you were unwell. Life has a vulgar sense of humor. But truth is strange that way. Once you strip away vanity, performance, and the story everyone thought they were inside, what remains can be surprisingly human. Sienna and I did not become friends quickly. We became honest first. She took responsibility without dramatics. Never once asked me to comfort her about David. Never once reframed herself as a victim to avoid the fact that she had participated, even if she eventually helped dismantle what she joined. She answered every question I asked. Some of those answers cost her. That mattered. 3 months after the settlement, she called me from outside a flower shop in Lincoln Park and said, "I know I don't get to ask favors, but my younger sister is interviewing at a hotel group in Nashville and I wondered if you'd look at her resume." That was super